page 239, chapter 13, Eco-Criticism, section, Eco-Criticism or Green Studies. Quote, simply defined, eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, unquote. Cheryl, Cherryll, Glotfelty, Glotfelty. But should we call it eco-criticism or green studies? Both terms are used to denote a critical approach which began in the USA in the late 1980s and in the UK in the early 1990s, and since it is still an emergent movement, it is worth briefly setting out its institutional history to date. In the USA, the acknowledged founder is Cheryl Glotfelty, co-editor with Harold Fromm, Fromm, of a key collection of helpful and definitive essays entitled The Eco-Criticism Reader, Landmarks in Literary Ecology, University of Georgia Press, 1996. In 1992, she was also the co-founder of ASLE, pronounced as ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. ASLE has its own house journal called ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, which started in 1993. So American eco-criticism was already a burgeoning academic movement by the early 1990s, beginning to establish its professional infrastructure of designated journals and an official corporate body. However, unlike most of the theories discussed in this book, it is still distinctly on the academic margins. The present book is the first of the many available general readers and introductions to literary theory to mention eco-criticism, and the movement still does not have a widely known set of assumptions, doctrines, or procedures. Since eco-criticism in the USA seems to be strongest in the universities of the West, that is, away from the largest cities and from the major academic power centers of the page 240 East and West coasts, we might expect it to embody, quote, decentrist, DECENTRIST, unquote, ideals of this kind. Para. Eco-criticism as a concept first arose in the late 1970s at meetings of the WLA, the Western Literature Association, a body whose field of interest is the literature of the American West. In his introduction to a series of brief position papers, all entitled What is Eco-Criticism?, Michael P. Branch, Branch, Michael Michael, traces the word eco-criticism back to William Ruckert's Rueckert' 1978 essay, Literature and Ecology, an Experiment in Eco-Criticism. A claim, footnote 1. Branch's introduction and the 12 short pieces presented in a 1994 symposium, one, eco-criticism can all be assessed. One, co-criticism can all be accessed in the ASLE website at www.asle.org/site/resources/ecocritical library/intro/defining. Back to text. A claim for first usage in literary criticism of the related term ecological is made by prominent U.S. critic Karl Kroeber, Kroeber, Karl, Karl, whose article Home at Grasmere, Grasmere, Ecological Holiness, appeared in the journal PMLA 89, 1974, pages 132 to 141. Both terms, eco-criticism and ecological, apparently lay dormant in the critical vocabulary, says Branch, until the 1989 WLA conference in Coeur, Alene, A-L-E-N-E, USA, when Cheryl Clotfelty, at the time a graduate student at Cornell University, subsequently Associate Professor of Literature and the Environment at the University of Nevada, Reno, not only revived the term eco-criticism but urged its adoption to refer to the diffuse critical field that had previously been known as, quote, the study of nature writing, unquote, full stop, para. Eco-criticism as it now exists in the USA takes its literary bearings from three major 19th century American writers whose work celebrates nature, the life force, and the wilderness as manifested in America, these being Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, Margaret Fuller, F-U-L-L-E-R, 1810 to 1850, and Henry David Thoreau, Thoreau, 1817 to 1862. All three were members of the group of New England writers, essayists, and philosophers, known collectively as the Transcendentalists, the first major literary movement in America to achieve, quote, cultural independence, unquote, from European models. Emerson's first short book, Nature, first published anonymously in 1836, included in Ralph Waldo Emerson selected essays, e.d. Larzer, L-A-R-Z-E-R, Ziff, Z-I-F-F, Penguin, 1982, is a reflective rather than philosophical essay on the impact upon him of the natural world, page 241, often voiced in words of powerfully dramatic directness. Indent. Crossing a bare, in snow puddles, at twilight, under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Stop. I am glad to the brink of fear. Stop. Chapter 1, page 38, indent closes. Para. Fuller's first book was Summer on the Lakes during 1843, included in the portable Margaret Fuller Viking Penguin 1994, which is a powerfully written journal of her encounter with the American landscape at large after a period as the first woman student at Harvard at Niagara, Niagara. For instance, she writes, indent, for here there is no escape from the weight of a perpetual creation, semicolon. All other forms and motions come and go. The tide rises and recedes, the wind, at its mightiest, moves in gales and gusts, but here is really an incessant, an indefatigable motion. Awake or asleep, there is no escape, still this rushing round you and through you. Stop. It is in this way I have most felt the grandeur, somewhat eternal, if not infinite. Page 71, indent closes, para. Thoreau's Walden, Oxford University Press, World's Classics 1999, WALDN, is an account of his 2-year stay from 1845 in a hut he had built on the shore of Walden Pond, a couple of miles from his hometown of Concord, Massachusetts. It is perhaps the classic account of dropping out of modern life and seeking to renew the self by a return to nature. This is certainly a book which has always exerted a strong effect on the attitudes of its readers. These 3 books can be seen as the foundational works of American eco-centered writing. Para. By contrast, the UK version of eco-criticism or green studies takes its bearings from the British Romanticism of the 1970s rather than the American Transcendentalism of the 1840s. The founding figure on the British side is the critic Jonathan Bate, B-A-T-E, author of Romantic Ecology, Wordsworth and the Environmental Tradition, Routledge 1991. British eco-critics also make the point that many of their concerns are evident before the term eco-criticism existed in Raymond Williams's book The Country and the City, Chatto and Windus, 1973. The infrastructure of eco-criticism in the UK is less developed than in the USA. There are as yet no indigenous journals, page 242, or formal bodies for eco-critics to join, though there is a UK branch of ASLI, but the provision of relevant course options as undergraduate degree programs is becoming more widespread, especially in new universities and colleges of higher education. Of course, institutional affiliations change, but at the time of writing, apart from Bate himself, who teaches at the University of Warwick, most of the active British proponents of eco-criticism were based at these institutions, such as Lawrence Laurance Coupe, COUPE, at Manchester Metropolitan University, Richard Kerridge, KERRIDGE, and Greg Gerard, GARRARD, both at Bath Spa University, and Terry Gifford, GIFFORD, at the former Breton Hall College, now part of the University of Leeds, LEEDS. The definitive UK collection of essays having equivalent status in the UK to that of Glotfelty and Fromm in the USA is Lawrence Coupe's The Green Studies Reader, From Romanticism to Eco-Criticism, Routledge 2000, para. The existence of two distinct national variants of the ecological approach suggests a situation similar to the one described in Chapter 9, in which we saw how British cultural materialism and American new historicism are clearly linked in their approaches and aims, but differ in emphasis and ancestry. Generally, the preferred American term is eco-criticism, whereas green studies is frequently used in the UK, and there is perhaps a tendency for the American writing to be celebratory in tone, occasionally degenerating into what harder left critics disparagingly call tree-hugging, whereas the British variant tends to be more minatory, minatory, that is, it seeks to warn us of environmental threats emanating from governmental, industrial, commercial and neo-colonial forces. For instance, Bate's more recent book, The Song of the Earth, Picador 2000, argues that colonialism and deforestation have frequently gone together. Footnote 2. He writes, quote, as Robert Pogue, Pogue Harrison, has demonstrated on his remarkable book Forests, the Shadow of Civilization, imperialism has always brought with it deforestation and the consuming of natural resources, unquote, page 87. Back to text, section Culture and Nature. What attitudes then are characteristic of eco-criticism, irrespective of which national variant is in question? This subsection indicates the scope of some of the debates within eco-criticism concerning the crucial matter of the relationship between culture and nature. Perhaps the most fundamental point to make here is that eco-critics reject the notion common to most of the other theories considered in this book, that everything is socially and or linguistically constructed, which is the first item in the list of 5 recurrent ideas in critical theory given on pages 32 to 35 above. For the eco-critic, nature really exists out there beyond ourselves, not needing to be ionized as a concept by enclosure within knowing inverted commas, but actually present as an entity which affects us and which we can affect, perhaps fatally, if we mistreat it. Nature then isn't reducible to a concept which we conceive as part of our cultural practice, as we might conceive a deity, for instance, and project it out onto the universe. Theory in general tends to see our external world as socially and linguistically constructed, as, quote, always, already, unquote, textualized into discourse. But eco-criticism calls this long-standing theoretical orthodoxy into question, sometimes rather impatiently, as in Kate Soper's S-O-P-E-R'(S) frequently quoted remark in her seminal book What is Nature, page 151, that, quote, it isn't language which has a hole in its ozone layer, stop, unquote. Eco-criticism then repudiates the foundational belief in constructedness, which is such an important aspect of literary theory. Of course, that belief in the universality of social constructedness was always vulnerable to the objection that, if true, it would necessarily be unknowable, since everything would include the idea itself that, quote, everything is socially and linguistically constructed, unquote. In the 1980s, social construction gangs seemed to be everywhere, digging up and replacing the academic sidewalks, and for the most part their work is still in place, constituting the main academic thoroughfare in the humanities. So the difficulty of either verifying or falsifying the view that everything is socially or linguistically constructed has not diminished its grip on day-to-day debate about literary theory. Nevertheless, the essence of eco-criticism's intervention in theory has been to challenge it. Section. This crucial point, however, should not be taken as implying that eco-critics hold a naive, pre-theoretical notion of nature. There have been set-piece confrontations on this issue which will repay study and are equivalent in importance to the key debates over the fundamentals of theory mentioned elsewhere in this book, such as, page 244, the exchange between F. R. Lewis and René Wellek in the 1930s over the principles of literary criticism, page 16, and the dialogue between P. W. Betson and Roger Fowler over linguistics and literary criticism in the 1960s, page 199. In the case of eco-criticism, some of the most heated exchanges have been between the American Wordsworth critic Alan Liu, L-I-U, and various eco-critics including Jonathan Bett in Romantic Ecology, Karl Kroeber in Ecological Literary Criticism, and Terry Gifford, originally in ISLE in 1996 and reprinted in Coupe's The Green Studies Reader, pages 173 to 176. The key feature of Liu's position is the view that calling something nature and seeing it as simply given is usually a way of avoiding the politics which has made it the way. Of course, it can be so. For instance, the well-known 19th century children's hymn by C.F. Alexander, quote, all things bright and beautiful, unquote, originally contained the notorious lines, long omitted from most editions, indent, the rich man in his castle, comma, the poor man at his gate, semicolon, he made them high and lowly, and ordered their estate, stop, indent closes. It is obvious here that social inequality is being naturalized, that is, literally disguised as nature, and viewed as a situation which is God-given and inescapable, when actually it is the product of a specific politics and power structure. Perhaps Karl Marx had such sentiments in mind when he said in his quote, "Critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right," unquote, in 1844, that religion is the opium of the people. The left's long-standing assumption is that any invocation of nature will have the side effect of disguising politics and so legitimating inequalities and injustices. Hence, for Liu, in Bett's paraphrase of his position, quote, "There is no nature, ... in other words, nature within quote, is nothing more than an anthropomorphic construct created by Wordsworth and the rest for their own purposes," unquote. Coupe, p. 171. Liu's now notorious remark is a frequent target in eco-critical writing and has been paradoxically a valuable stimulus to the definition and crystallization of eco-critical positions. See, for instance, the chapter Surprised by Nature, Ecology and Cold War Criticism in Kroeber's book listed below. Gifford quotes Liu directly to the effect that nature is the name under which we use the non-human to validate the human, page 245, to interpose a mediation able to make humanity more easy with itself, unquote. Coupe, page 175. Gifford's response is to say that, quote, "While Liu is right to identify the word nature as a mediation within quote, he is wrong to deny the general physical presence that is one side of that mediation," unquote. Page 175. Indeed, the meaning of the word nature is a key site of struggle for nearly all the theories discussed in this book, and it is the word with one of the longest entries in Raymond Williams's influential book, Keywords, Keywords, which is a glossary of key terms and concepts from cultural history. Footnote 3. I recall Williams at a conference on literary theory in the 1980s becoming increasingly irritated at the nervous apologies offered by speakers whenever they had to use the word nature. Even apparently innocent phrases like "the nature of the problem" had become taboo or were felt to require elaborate fumigation before being used in public. Back to text para. Perhaps it is appropriate in a late chapter of a book of this kind to say that this issue of the social and linguistic constructedness of reality, sometimes called the problem of the real, has been one of the areas on which the teaching of theory has tended to generate confusion. Of course, attitudes to nature vary, and some of the variations are culturally determined, but the fact that a phenomenon is regarded differently in different cultures doesn't call its reality into question. Like Terry Gifford, Coupe, page 176, I can point to my own bald head as evidence of the overarching grand narrative of nature, which contains us all in the cycle of growth, maturity, and decay. I may have plenty of Lyotardian, Lyotardian, incredulity within quote, towards this narrative, but it won't make any difference. Yet, aging, both as a fact and as a concept, features differently in different cultures. Some cultures regard it as almost a shameful thing, so that the elderly affect youthful styles of speech, dress, tastes, and behavior. Other cultures and other eras regarded it as honorable and admirable, as an index of the possession of wisdom or understanding, for instance. Thus, traditional representations of Socrates or God The farther show elderly grey-bearded patriarchal figures in flowing garments rather than glossy, sharply dressed, youngish men or women, as if age and masculinity were the natural fleshly garb of the quote, wisdom of the ages, unquote. But these different culturally determined ways of regarding the fact of aging should not prevent us from realizing that, page 246, it doesn't follow that age is socially constructed or that it is part of culture rather than nature. Such statements, we must be clear, are figurative and hyperbolic, they gesture towards an element of truth, but they must not be passed off as literal truth. They are like the statements sometimes made about actors in film advertisements which proclaim, for instance, that Marlon Brando is the godfather. In teaching literary theory, we have perhaps not made this and kindred distinctions as clear as we ought to have done. One of the welcome side effects of eco-criticism is to bring this vital issue to the fore, making us clarify our thoughts about it, even if somewhat belatedly. Para. A related issue which is also thrown into relief by eco-criticism is whether a distinction is deconstructed into self-contradiction by the fact that, like the nature/culture distinction, it is not always absolute and clear-cut. At one level, this can be answered very easily. The existence of distinction is not undermined at all by the simultaneous existence of intermediate states. Grey is real, but its existence doesn't destabilize the difference between black and white. If we translate this into issues directly relevant to eco-criticism, we can say that we have nature and culture and states partaking of both, and that all three are real. Consider, for instance, what we can call the outdoor environment as a series of adjoining and overlapping areas which move gradually from nature to culture along the following lines. Indent. Area 1, quote, the wilderness, unquote, e.g., deserts, oceans, uninhabited continents. Area 2, the scene sublime, within quote, e.g., forests, lakes, mountains, cliffs, waterfalls. Area 3, the countryside, within quote, e.g., hills, fields, woods. Area 4, within quote, the domestic picturesque, e.g., parks, gardens, lanes. Para. As we move mentally through these areas, it is clear that we move from pretty well pure nature in the first to what is predominantly culture in the fourth. Of course, the wilderness is affected by global warming, which is cultural, and gardens depend on sunlight, which is a natural force. But neither concept, nature or culture, is thereby invalidated. Furthermore, the two middle areas, to varying degrees, contain large elements of both culture and nature, so that we might have doubts about the right positioning of some of the component elements within them. Parenthesis, should mountains be categorized as part of the area 1, hills as area 2, parenthesis closes. Page 247. But these uncertainties should not be seen as destabilizing the fundamental distinction between nature and culture. Even if it could be shown that all four areas were actually different degrees or kinds of culture, it would still not follow that there is no such thing as nature. In the same way, the fact that drizzle is merely a kind of rain does not mean that there is no such thing as drizzle, nor does it mean that it makes no difference whether we say it's raining or it's drizzling. Para. If we return to the four environmental areas, it will be clear that most of what is called nature writing concerns the two middle ones. 18th century topographical writing, which might be exemplified by James Thomson's The Seasons, 1730, Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, 1751, and William Cowper's The Task, 1785, had Area 3 as its preferred location, while British Romantic writing like Wordsworth's The Prelude, 1805, in its best-known form, often centered on Area 2. But American transcendentalist writing of the 19th century was predominantly interested in Area 1, mountain ranges, prairies, colossal cataracts, space itself. Footnote 4. See for instance Thoreau's essay Walking, extracted in Coupe, pages 23 to 25, which discusses these matters. He writes, quote, "I do not know of any poetry to quote which adequately expresses this yearning for the wild." Unquote. Stop. Back to text. Areas 3 and 4 are often the setting for domestic fiction and lyric poetry, both of which center upon relationships between human beings, while the first two areas are the preferred settings for epic and saga, which center on relations between human beings and cosmic forces, fate, destiny, the deity, etc., and for Promethean, Promethean narratives in which human beings test the limits of their scope and powers, such as Milton's Paradise Lost, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The wilderness is entered as if instinctively by those who would find themselves Moses ascends the mountain to receive the commandments. Christ goes into the wilderness to pray. The aboriginal initiate goes walkabout in the bush. Huck Finn lights out for the territories, and so on. These spaces then seem to perform a special function for us, a function vital to our well-being, though this, of course, is to view, page 248, view them anthropocentric, human-centered fashion as if they existed for our benefit, a point which deep ecology would resist. The point repeatedly made by eco-critics is that, for the first time in human history, no true wilderness any longer exists on the planet, for every region is affected by global warming and other anthropocentric problems such as toxic waste and nuclear fallout. Our sense of these problems will vary, but we surely need to concede at least that issues of gender, race, and class cannot any longer exhaust the range of concerns that literature and criticism ought to have, though social ecologist and ecofeminist will rightly seek to blend such concerns with an ecologically driven program and outlook. Seeking to contribute to rectifying injustices in the areas of gender, race, and class is a praiseworthy aim for critics and theorists to have, but it isn't sensible to ignore the fact that making a difference in these presupposes that we can manage to avoid environmental catastrophe. Otherwise, it might seem like working flat out to secure improved working conditions for the crew as the Titanic speeds towards the iceberg. Section Turning Criticism Inside Out. An eco-critical reading of a literary text is simply one which in some way incorporates a consideration of the kind of issues and concerns we have just been discussing. But there is, as we have said, no universally accepted model that we have merely to learn and apply. Often it is just a matter of approaching perhaps very familiar texts with a new alertness to this dimension, a dimension which has perhaps always hovered about the text, but without ever receiving our full attention before. This is well illustrated in the opening of a short piece by Ralph W. Black entitled, quote, "What We Talk About When We Talk About Eco-Criticism," unquote. On page 248, footnote 5, Bate distinguishes light greens and dark greens from the Song of the Earth, page 37, the former are environmentalists who value nature because it environs humanity and contributes to our well-being. They believe we can save the planet by more responsible forms of consumption and production. Dark greens or deep ecologists take a more radical stance. Technology is the problem and therefore can't be the solution, so we have in some way to get back to nature. They dislike the anthropocentric term environment, preferring nature viewed as being there for its own sake, not ours. Page 249, indent. Not long ago I saw King Lear again. Olivier's Lear, I marvelled as usual at Lear's deep rage and deeper sadness, and I cried as usual as he carried Cordelia's body across the stage at the end. But I was struck even more by the beginning. A map of the kingdom is unrolled. It is painted across the tanned hides of a small herd of royal deer. The old sovereign uses his sword to symbolically divide his domain among his daughters. Even before the daughters have spoken or refused to speak the trajectory of their love, there is this transgression. The commodified landscape is sliced up and parcelled out to the highest rhetorical bidder. For a moment I wonder about my understanding of the tragedy, about what hubristic Hubristic act instigates Lear's fall, about the significance of the natural world in the play, the moments of clarity that all seem to take place outside, in a storm on the moors at the seashore. Indent closes, footnote 6. This is one of the items from the symposium mentioned in footnote 1. Back to text. These introductory remarks signal a reading of Lear which would have a distinctly different flavor from any other, not because the play is being reduced to ecological considerations, but rather because these are being added for the first time to all the other issues which more traditional approaches have always seen in the play. Such a reading would remind us that the slice of the kingdom available to Cordelia, the third more opulent, provided she says what her father wants to hear, is real peopled landscape. Hills, fields, rivers, farms, communities which are about to be randomly chopped up at the monarch's whim as if they had no claims or integrity of their own. Likewise, the blasted heath on which Lear enacts his madness is a real place located somewhere within this territory, and perhaps emblematic in its blastedness of the neglect and degradation which that territory suffers as a political consequence of Lear's act. The storm, too, isn't just the emblematic correlative of Lear's madness, but real weather representing the natural processes which his unnatural behavior refuses to come to terms with. Processes such as his own aging and his consequent sidelining by the following generation. Quote, all old men are King Lear, unquote, said Tolstoy, and Freud, too, page 250, was Lear as an archetypal family drama. Ecocritical readings of canonical texts then began by adding a different perspective and are not limited to works self-evidently about nature. Para. But the Lear reading implied here does have one other characteristic which is worth noting, particularly namely the way it tends to turn the conventional manner of reading inside out, so to speak. By this is meant that its strategy seems to be to switch critical attention from inner to outer, so that what had seemed mere setting is brought in front, the critical margins to the critical center, so that among other things the storm is a storm and not just a metaphor for the turmoil in Lear's mind. I want to illustrate this important move, this refusal to privilege the inner over the outer, at slightly greater length using another text as example, the aim being to emphasize that this need not be a reductive move and that the complexity which is after all the lifeblood of our literary study is thereby enriched rather than diluted. The text I am using here is Edgar Allan Poe's well-known tale, quote, The Fall of the House of Usher, unquote, footnote 7. Footnote 7, if you do not have it to hand, you can download the complete text from a website such as www.kingkong.demon.co.uk/gsr/usher.htm. Back to text. In the tale, Roderick Usher and his sister, Madeline, undergo a kind of voluntary imprisonment in the ancient, crumbling, isolated house of Usher, which stands next to an evil-looking lake, a black and lurid tarn, T-A-R-N, that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, unquote. The sister suffers from a strange wasting disease, while Usher himself, a being of lofty and spiritual ideality, is afflicted by a morbid acuteness of the senses, which makes him unable to bear any contact with the natural world. Quote, the odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, unquote. His only contact with the world beyond himself is through art, and when the narrator first encounters him, quote, many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but fail to give any vitality to the scene, unquote. Para. The tale is usually read with a focus on the morbid psychology of Usher, and on the strange way in which the narrator's arrival triggers Madeline's decline. The narrator's complicity in her premature entombment in the vault directly beneath his own room is described, as well as his orchestration of her reappearance. He reads aloud to Usher, page 251, from a lurid novel which parallels the grotesque drama of breakout and resurgence taking place below. The shock of seeing his resurrected sister kills the neurasthenic Usher, and because the presence of the unnamed narrator triggers all these events, it is common to read Usher and Madeline as aspect of the narrator's own being, that is, as the subconscious underside of his rationality. This is a common literary critical ploy. The external, whether characters, objects, situations, or events, is read as internal, in this case as elements of the subconscious. Para. The eco-centered reading, by contrast, focuses outside on the house and its environs rather than inside on the owner and his psychology. It uses ideas of energy, entropy, E-N-T-R-O-P-Y, which is a kind of negative energy within systems which tends towards breakdown and disorganization, and symbiosis, S-Y-M-B-I-O-S-I-S, literally living together, denoting mutually sustaining, coexisting systems. Thus, the house exists as an isolated entropic system which has no symbiotic connection at all with the broader biosphere. The stagnant lake reflects the house's own unmoving image. The house breathes in the atmosphere of its own decay. The quote, gradually at certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own above the waters and the walls, unquote. It has its own shield of microclimate, and as the climax approaches, it seems to stew in its own locked up and aborted energies. For when Usher and the narrator look out of the window, quote, the exceeding density of the clouds, parenthesis, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, parenthesis closes, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew, careening, C-A-R-W-R-I-N-G, careering from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance, unquote. The house of Usher then is not part of a living system. No new elements come in from outside to energize it and enable it to contribute to other systems. It is a light that failed, a stream which has created to flow, a fire with nothing to burn. Its narcissistic aloofness from the flow of the broader life force turns it into a kind of black hole which becomes a vortex into which its energies are sucked and destroyed. Quote, a whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, unquote, says the narrator when he looks out of the window, and we also have the black turn or leg into which the house collapses and disappears at the end. Most eerie of all is Usher's mind, quote, from which darkness, comma, as if an inherent positive quality, comma, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe, page 252, in one unceasing radiation of gloom, unquote. Usher then radiates not energy but entropy, like an imploded star rushing towards its own disintegration. Frighteningly, he is all culture and no nature. He is photophobic, hypersensitive to light, and cannot bear natural light at all, and prefers the represented light in paintings. He cannot bear natural sounds either, only the processed sound of music. What is imaged here then is an ecosystem damaged beyond repair and in its death throes, THROES. This is life on a cooling planet, a system clogged with its own detritus, DETRITUS, and cut off from any possible sources of catharsis or renewal. On this reading, the center of the story is not a dark night of the soul with its accompanying ontological anxieties, but the permanent night of willfully coated ecological disaster, comma, nuclear winter, comma, or solar exhaustion. This is a more frightening tale than conventional readings usually produce, for when the narrator runs from the collapsing house, there will be nowhere for him to run to. Section Stop and Think.